you always want to set downhill. So the hook set should be a firm stroke, but a short range of motion. So, fairly firm, but 12 to 18 inches. Good hard set, back into the trout's jaw is what I recommend doing. And you have to be realistic too with when you're fishing, 22s and 24s, that you're not going to land all your fish. You're going to land about 50% of your fish and on a good day. So
that was Pat Dorsey talking about how to set the hook properly for trout. Back to the Rocky Mountain High. This is episode number 56 of the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show.
Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, where you discover tips, tricks, and tools from the leading names in fly fishing today. We'll help you on your fly fishing journey with classic stories covering steelhead fishing, fly tying, and much more.
How's it going, everyone? Thanks for stopping by the Fly Fishing Show. Head over to wetflyswing.com/Patreon to check out a new way to join the journey here and get bonus content, including some upcoming local meetups and the new Steelhead ebook that's coming out. You can get that for free over there. And in today's episode, I interview Pat Dorsey, known as one of the best guides in Colorado and an expert on tailwaters. We talk about timing midges and tailwaters, how to cover water effectively, and how to sight fish for brown trout. Find out about the best hooks for tiny flies and why presentation is the most important thing when we're talking about fishing these tiny flies on tailwaters. Don't miss this one as Pat shares the top red flags to think about to avoid spooking fish. Before I get into the episode today, I wanted to take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. The Gray Drake produces beautiful vintage fly boxes and wallets that are handmade in the USA. Made with sustainable cork, reducing environmental impacts and still providing for the highest quality product. A portion of all proceeds go to local fish conservation. Go to thegraydrake.com to get started today. We are also brought to you by the Portland Fly Shop, which is your winter steelhead headquarters. They stock all of the top brands and a huge selection of fly tying materials. Conveniently located right off Gleason Street off of 405. It's always great to walk into the store when you're greeted by a friendly dog and and personalized service. So head over to theportlandflyshop.com or stop in and see him today. So without further ado, here's Pat Dorsey. How's it going, Pat?
pretty good. How are you?
Good. Thanks for coming on the show. I'm going to hope to dig in here pretty deep on tailwater fishing and kind of tiny flies. There's a lot of, I know you've covered that topic before. That's your specialty, and I want to definitely go deep into that. But before we get there, can you start us off and talk about how you first got into fly fishing and bring us back to today?
You bet. I was extremely blessed to have a father that was passionate about fly fishing. So I grew up fishing both freestones and tailwaters, but I gravitated towards the tailwater side of things just because I enjoyed the technical side of the sport, and just catching, tough fish on small flies became my niche. And been guiding now for about 25 years, and that's the passion that I share with my guest every day, is just that hardcore, tough tailwater fishing, and really enjoy sharing that with my folks.
So you basically, I mean, as long as you remember back, you kind of been doing the fly fishing thing, or did you start out first doing some of the spin stuff, or do you remember all that period?
I did a little spin fishing like everybody early on, but my dad did start me out with a fly and a bubble, and then I went into a fly rod, and we started out on lakes when I was a young man, and I learned how to start tying flies from my Uncle Jim when I was also very young, and it just led to a career path in the fly fishing world. I just wanted to do what I love to do most for a living.
When did you know that it was going to be your career path?
Oh, probably 30 years ago. I started out as a commercial fly tyer, and then when I was out with my father, I'd seen some guides working with clients, and I always thought that would be really cool to do that for a living. And in 1992, I was fortunate enough to get hired on with the Blue Quill Angler, which is my home today. I'm a co-owner of the Blue Quill Angler Fly Shop, and I've been there for 25 years and been able to make a living as a fly fishing guide, which is a real treat for me.
Yeah, and on one of what's known as, I haven't fished it before, but just some of the rivers you fish, I guess the South Platte especially is known as some of the most challenging fishing out there. I wanted to dig into that tailwater fishery and how you do it, but I wanted to hear a little more about, before I get there, a little bit more about that commercial fly tying. So you have the background with your family. I think so your dad and grandfather were in fly fishing, or just your dad?
My dad and my grandfather were in fly fishing, but my father and my grandfather never really tied flies, to speak about. I mean, but my uncle was a super passionate fly fisherman as well as a fly tyer. And so when I was, 10 years old, my Uncle Jim, he taught me how to tie a red ant, which is one of his specialty patterns back then. And then, like many other fly fishers, you learned how to teach yourself how to tie flies from the Jack Dennis manuals. That was really the best source of information back then. And Jack became a mentor of mine, and I learned so much from him. But when I was raising my family, I was tying flies, and lots of them.
Mm-hmm. And then, and so you mentioned Jack Dennis, definitely, obviously a huge name, and in fly fishing. Are there any other people that had a big influence on you, similar to Jack, along the way?
Jack was obviously a huge mentor of mine, and I think if one name stands out, that's him. And today we're still good friends, and I just appreciate all that he's done for me, and that's kind of my goal, Now I like to give back to the fly fishing community and help, young anglers that are trying to enter the sport, or young guides that are trying to enter the sport. And I think that's really an important thing to give back.
Yeah, for sure. What's I definitely occasionally talk to some younger kids. Do you have any maybe a tip for that young kid that's listening right now that wants to get into it, that wants to maybe be a guide or get into fly fishing, what he can do to get prepared for it?
Well, I think, you have to follow your heart, and, if you want to do it, then you got to do it, and don't let anybody tell you that it's not feasible. I mean, it's tough when you start out, you're going to start working for a shop and you'll probably be on the bottom of the guide rotation. But, if you work your way up and you're a professional and you start getting a return clientele, then things just keep moving along, and it's such a rewarding career. I mean, there's so many people in this world that are unhappy with their jobs and what they do for a living, but I truly am jazzed up about going to work every day. And the waters that I guide on are technically challenging, so you have to bring your A game every day. So you really have to be prepared, and you have to be ready to go to work. Otherwise, you can get humbled pretty quick out there.
And what do you think for you is the kind of the most rewarding thing about guiding?
Well, for me, it's always important to establish goals and expectations either before the trip or that morning of the trip. And, for me, I want my anglers to be better fishermen at the end of the day. And if I've done that and accomplished that goal, then I'm pretty excited about the trip. And the guide day never really ends, in my opinion. I always give out my card and I let people contact me freely for more information. And, you just keep learning. And that's the greatest part about this is nobody knows it all, and we just keep learning as we go along.
Yep. Yeah, that's what it's all about. What about guiding again. So if maybe you can take us back, to somebody who hasn't been on a trip with you, that first time when they walk up and meet up with you and the whole process, and kind of before you jump into that, can you talk about just along with that, just somebody who doesn't even know what a tailwater is, and explain, kind of briefly what a tailwater is and why it can be challenging to catch fish there, or why it can be great, I guess, as well.
Right. Well, a tailwater is a year-round fishery because of the outflow coming from the base of a dam. So when you refer to a tailwater or a tail race, it's the fishery below a still water impoundment. And there's a lot of variables with these fisheries. Some are top release, some are bottom release, some generate power. So there's a lot of challenges that are associated with tailwaters depending upon where you are. The South Platte, the tailwater that I guide most of the time, is technically challenging because it's cold water, it's clear water, it receives a lot of pressure, the aquatic life is small, and it's a difficult place to catch fish. And the South Platte, in Cheeseman Canyon, where I do a large percentage of my guiding, there's a common belief amongst South Platte regulars that if you can catch a fish in Cheeseman Canyon, you can probably catch fish just about anywhere in the world. And so it's a very, very humbling fishery. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, you have to always bring your A game. Otherwise, it can be a tough day.
Nice. And I want to talk a little more about Cheeseman Canyon, but can you bring us back to that, that moment where, so I'm going on a trip with you, I'm meeting you out, I guess on the river at the shop, or can you just take us to that point when you first get on the river and what it feels like as a client of yours? The whole process.
Yeah, I mean, I just begin with what they want to accomplish for the day. I mean, some people could care less about catching fish, but they're more concerned about getting better. And that's what I feed off of. I feed off of somebody who is passionate about fly fishing. I like it when they tie their own flies, and you share those common bonds. But my goal is it's their day, and I know it costs a lot of money to fish with me, and obviously the stakes are high when you're collecting $500 for a guide trip. But at the day's end, I just want them to have a good time. I want them to improve, and for 8 hours, we are side by side and having a great time. And when they catch a fish, I catch a fish. And that's what's so rewarding about guiding, is you actually get to fish through your customer for that day. And you fish it a lot or you guide it a lot like you would if you were out fishing on your own. And that's such a rewarding experience. As I mentioned, when they catch fish, you catch a fish, and it's a pretty good feeling.
So what does it feel like when they don't catch fish, or do you have those times where the fishing's just really bad? And I mean, how do you deal with that? And I guess again, that's expectations, but what's that? How does that process go down when and are you typically fishing like half days, full days?
I do. The majority of my trips are full days. They're 8-hour trips. So I usually will meet my customer in the morning around 6:30 or 7, and then we hike in, and that can be anywhere from 1 mile to 3 miles, depending upon the time of day and the day of the week, whether it's a weekend or weekday. But there's just a lot of variables that you can't control. I mean, for instance, if you're on the water and the Denver Water Board decides to raise some water to meet downstream irrigation demand, then obviously that can affect the fishing. And so that can be a challenge. So, you're dealing with rising flows, you're dealing with declining flows, sporadic catches at times, people, excessive crowds, etc. So, you just have to be willing to adapt to these changes. And, usually you can make it happen. Obviously, you have slow days, and those are the tough ones when you get home in the evening and you've had a challenging day and you didn't, catch as many fish as that you'd hoped for. But, that's fishing. And if you're a pro and you work through those things, those kind of things do happen, but you still are a teacher at the day's end, and you've taught your client a lot of new skills and tactics and techniques that hopefully will elevate their game down the road.
Yeah. I guess that's the point, is being a guide, you can have a slow fishing day, but they're going to learn a lot more things from you, including some good water to fish. And that kind of ties into, again, out there when you get heavy traffic and, people, guides, and lots of people on the river. I know that river is pretty heavily fished. How do you deal with that? And then what sort of tips would you give somebody else that's heading there in a very heavily fished area to kind of have a successful day?
Well, I think, you need to know the river intimately. That's important. I think a lot of anglers get trapped in a rut, and they kind of, return to the same piece of water based on previous success. They've done really well in this particular run or riffle or whatever, and they continuously go back. But, things change as far as conditions are concerned. It could be high or low or a different time of the year. But, I try to, move around based on the prevailing conditions. And they do vary greatly between winter and summer. Right now, as we go into the winter months, the fish are starting to, move into the slower, deeper water where they'll overwinter now for the next several months. So obviously targeting the correct water is very, very important. And then moving around, I tend to move a lot. I cover a lot of water. I generally will fish, a mile or two of water a day. So making a few casts in a particular area, try to catch fish, then move on. And, I try to do that so that my customer gets exposed to a wide range of water types throughout the day and different circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And is that a key for tailwaters? Is just you just want to cover as much water as possible during the day. If you're not getting, you go to a spot and you don't get a positive reinforcement within a few casts, you keep moving. And are you also breaking up the river into kind of little zones as you're going, or how do you work that?
Yeah, if I'm working a traditional, riffle run pool tail out, then I'm going to spend a little bit more time in there than I would if I was fishing pocket water or something like that. So again, I think, as an angler, whether you're a guide or just a fisherman for the day, etiquette is extremely important. And so you need to move around and, not stay in the same hole all the time, because, you hate to see somebody, fish the same hole for 3 or 4 hours. It's not good etiquette. Right.
And I guess, and you could, so people do that and they do catch fish. I mean, zoning in on one little spot, that's, it's interesting, different styles. Well, there's a lot of stuff I want to dig into. I guess we can just jump in, first when we're thinking about, we talked about the top about tiny flies and fishing tailwaters. Can you, I guess first talk a little bit about, tiny flies. Are we just talking about midges, or maybe you can explain what we mean by tiny flies, and then take us back to how you catch fish over there on the tailwater, the whole process for you.
As a general rule, as a tailwater enthusiast, most of the flies that you're going to be fishing are going to be sizes 18 down to 24. And on a rare occasion, like this time of year, then we'll drop down to 26s. And, there's sometimes the difference between catching fish and not catching fish is fishing a 24 instead of a 20 or a 22. So that's one of the variables that I can't control. I can't control, the crowds. I can't control the flows and a lot of those situations, but I can control, my presentation, my drift, and the flies that I fish, which as a general rule, I think I fish smaller flies than the average person. So obviously understanding, the aquatic life and having a good idea of the entomology is going to be an important part to success. So matching the hatch based on, the prevailing hatches, whether it be spring, summer, or fall, or winter, you're going to increase your odds by having that knowledge and being able to fish the correct flies during those hatches.
Gotcha. So if you go in there, let's just take, for example, it's we're going close to December now, in that range. If you're in December, what's the start? Are you going to go in there? Do you have a couple flies in mind that you're going to start off with, or what's happening this time of year?
I do, and I don't switch flies a lot. I think, one of the most important things to being successful as an angler is keeping your downtime to a minimum. So I do have a few flies that I really think they're going to be effective this time of year. And what we're starting to see now is we're starting to see, a few sporadic betas still left. So mayfly nymphs can be important midday, but we're getting to the time of year where midges is going to be the main diet for these fish. So having midge larvae and midge pupa, and then of course some adults. If you see some rising fish to adult midges, then there's certain patterns. But I like a mercury midge, a black beauty, top secret midge. Those are some of my favorites. Sometimes some red midge larvae is very effective. And then Matt's midge and Grifiths Gnats and parachute Adams. Those are some of my go-to for dry flies. So it's fairly basic patterns, fairly common patterns, but pretty effective. And more importantly, keep them small this time of year and just really concentrate on precise dead drifts and sight fishing. That's one of the most important things this time of year is trying to keep your flies in front of fish. So I'm looking for small pods of fish and trying to concentrate my efforts on those.
Yeah, that's a great tip. So Now, with sight fishing, do you have any recommendations there, or how you can become a better sight fisherman, other than, I guess, wearing good polarized glasses? Any tips on making sure you're not spooking fish, or just getting into those fish?
Yeah, we've got really low flows right now. We're at about 60 CFS on the South Platte, so flows are low. So it's a great time of year to be able to sight fish. Some of the bigger fish are caught this time of year because you can actually see them and actually catch them. But the trade-off, of course, is they become a little bit on the edgy side. So definitely wear drab-colored clothing and be careful as you wade into the streams. And sometimes they'll spook just from an arm movement, when you're getting ready to cast and so on and so forth. So you do have to be a little bit stealthy this time of year. But, looking in the right water to begin with, which is going to be the slow water margins now, in those deeper pools and slower tail outs. And those present a challenge in themselves because of the slow water. They're just tougher to fool fish there. So, but, looking in the right place to begin with, and then you got to train your eye. I mean, sight fishing is a skill that takes a fair amount of practice, looking for browns and rainbows. You just got to practice to get better at that. Yep.
Yeah. And that's part of that's just knowing where maybe you're seeing a shadow or something where you're not necessarily seeing the whole fish. But like anything, it's just a little bit of a skill you develop over time.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, that's something that my guests each day really like to work on, because it is a difficult skill to master. But certainly once you do, I mean, the odds, of you catching more fish are going to go up greatly.
Gotcha. Okay. And so I've fished tailwaters before, and definitely the indicator with a midge underneath it. I mean, that's a technique that's done well for me. Can you explain a little bit about whether you're usually using indicators or that process in your terminal tackle setup? Again, if you, I guess, depending, say we're fishing nymphs, how you would do that?
Yeah, I mean, we do fish nymphs the majority of the time on the South Platte. It can be a good dry fly fishery, but as a general rule, you're going to nymph fish about 90% of the time when you come to the South Platte or most tailwaters. I mean, it's the most effective strategy, although you want to be prepared to fish streamers and dry flies. And I usually am, but nymphing, from a guide standpoint, is going to be the most reliable method to get, your customers on fish. So we can fish 3 flies in Colorado, and that does vary depending upon the state you go to. Montana, you can fish 2, and New Mexico, you can fish 2 in your tandem rig. So you need to make sure that you check the local regulations on the number of flies that you can fish. But typically, I use some sort of a tractor in my tandem nymphing rigs. And that changes greatly with the time of year. This time of year, I'm using a flashy midge of some sort, but you could use an egg pattern. You could use a caddis larva. You could use a stonefly. You could San Juan worm, a scud. And those are all just based around, what's going on that particular time of the year. So I kind of base my attractor off what's hatching at the current time. When the water gets low like it is now, you got to be careful that, you don't use something big and gaudy, because that can become a red flag and that can spook more fish than you actually attract. But then this bread and butter patterns off that attractor. Right now I've been running a Mercury midge on the top, and then dropping a size 24 Black Beauty, and then a size 24 Top Secret off of that. So I'm kind of imitating larva and pupa, and just doing a lot of mid-column fishing. Looking for suspended fish, which is a telltale that they're actually feeding, which is another important thing that you got to be concerned with. Are the fish that you're targeting feeding, or are they
sitting on the bottom?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, those are awesome. So I'm just picturing your setup. So you have your main attractor pattern, which might be, whatever's out there. Maybe it's a size 14 or 16, something a little bit bigger. And then off of that, you're tying it off the bend of the hook, your next fly down like 10 inches or something like that. And then you're tying the next one off the bend of the hook. Is that how you're doing it?
That's correct. I do. I take the attractor, and then 10 to 12 inches below that, I come off the bend to the preceding fly, and then another 10 to 12 inches there. So, and I typically will run my emergers and my pupa in the last dropper position, because you want those to ride higher in the current. And I tend to fish my larva and nymphs closer to the weight. And I keep my indicator 1.5 to 2 times the depth of the current. I'm a big fan of the yarn indicator. We use an orthodontic rubber band and a piece of yarn, which allows us to adjust this setup very easily. And then I start with a number 6 split shot about a foot above my attractor. And then I add JP's Nymphing mud, which is a moldable tungsten putty. And that allows me to fine tune my weight based on where the fish are holding in the water column.
Gotcha. So that's pretty much it. And on your leader, what type of leader are you using? And does it matter that much? Talking about size, I guess you're using small fly, so you want to use some pretty small leader.
Yeah, I mean, I typically start out with a 9-foot 4 or 5X leader, depending upon the size of my attractor fly. And clarity has, makes a difference too. And the volume of the water can make a difference on the size of the leader that you fish. But I would say day in and day out, a 9-foot 5X is what I use most of the time. And then I add, 12 to 14 inches of tippet and tie on my next fly. But I just use a nylon leader, and I use fluorocarbon tippet. I carry fluoro in 2X, 3X, 4X, 5X, and then I use 6X monofilament. And a lot of people are always intrigued with that type of rationale, but I haven't found that 6X fluoro and 6X mono make that big a difference. So mono is much more environmental friendly. And so I just go through spools of 6X nylon tippet. So
Gotcha. That makes sense. I had, getting back to the indicators, it's always an interesting topic. I had Gary Borger on in episode 45, and he talked about some cool stuff about his. He likes yarn indicators as well, and he actually even sometimes uses like up to 3 indicators on his leader, so he can fish different depths. And it was something I hadn't heard about before, but it makes sense that even maybe in your situation you might be scaring the fish if you got stuff indicators under the water. But can you talk a little bit about the indicators you use and why yarn is better than? I mean, you got the thingamabobbers, you got all these other indicators. Why you like yarn, and the type of yarn you use, or the type of material?
Yeah, we use a tan polycraft cord, and I don't think there's any doubt that yarn is the most sensitive strike indicator that you could use, and especially in slow water and winter fishing. I mean, it's going to detect the most subtle strikes that you're gonna see while you're nymphing. I mean, sometimes it'll just spin, or sometimes you'll just get a little tiny micro dimple underneath it. So I think that's one of the beauties of yarn is it will help you catch more fish because it's just a lot more sensitive. The tan yarn is not going to spook fish, and it hits the water soft. So I think, thingamabobbers are good to carry. I do carry them, and I use them in situations where the wind might be blowing, or my customer might be having a little bit more difficulty casting or something of that. But I would say 99% of the time I'm running a yarn indicator, just because I think it stacks the odds in your favor. And with that orthodontic rubber band, and it just allows you to adjust it frequently. And I think, that so many anglers they get trapped in a rut, and they put on a BB and they put on a thingamabobber, and they don't make those necessary adjustments that's important in catching more fish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I love, now that I've had a number of guests on, just hearing, everybody talk. And I haven't talked a lot about indicators, actually, because, I had, Devin Olson, some other guys that were talking about more of the, the Euro nymphing stuff. But I'm just thinking back to that Gary episode, and I think it was in the intro I put in there where he talked about how he doesn't necessarily use the indicator for detecting strikes. It's more to just tell him where his fly is at. Does that make sense to you? And I don't know if you want to. I could play a little clip of that real quick if we wanted to listen to that. But
now the purpose of the indicator is very interesting because, and I'm the one that really sort of promoted the whole concept of indicator fishing through that video that we did on nymphing. And the whole concept there is that the indicator, yeah, it can indicate that the fish is taking the fly, but the whole idea is it tells you the speed that the fly is going, because if the indicator is going the same speed as the foam on top, then the fly is going the same speed as the foam on top, which means the fly is not on the bottom. It's up near the top.
Does that make sense at all, as far as maybe it's not always indicating when the fish is on, but tells you about your fly?
Yeah, I mean, it does more than detect, that you've got a strike. I mean, it gives you a point in which you can mend and control drag. That's a beautiful thing. It does certainly help identify where your flies are. But I'm more of a traditional nymph fisherman, that I use the indicator. When you're high stick nymph, I mean, the indicator's doing the fishing for you, and that's the beautiful thing, because you're doing suspension nymphing. So you just have to adjust the weight and adjust the indicator depth to get your flies in the correct part of the water column. And so many times, in the tailwater world, you see the fish eat the fly well ahead of the indicator moving. So we're constantly looking for lifts or flashes, or even the mouth open. And it's amazing, I think that it's somewhere around a third of your strikes go completely undetected if you're relying strictly on the indicator alone. So the value of the indicator is it does help you detect strikes, especially in faster currents, because it'll tighten up quicker. But in slow water, I mean, it just really helps you get a good drift, and it helps you detect those very, very subtle strikes.
Yeah, so I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud to myself, like, so he's talking about more getting on the bottom. So you're talking about a different thing, right? You're talking about more of these fish that are kind of midstream or mid depth, right?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing, when you look at the water column, obviously the water on the surface is 2/3 faster than the water on the bottom, so it's moving quicker. So that is the beauty of being able to try to get your strike indicator floating about the same speed as those bubbles. And so obviously you use weight to get your flies down in the water column, but a lot of times you have to be careful too with the weight, because if you have suspended fish that are holding mid column, I mean, it's entirely possible to be fishing below those fish. So the weight management is critical for nymph fishing. And I think that's where, a lot of little things add up to big things as a tailwater enthusiast. You have to be, a master of the nuances. You have to be constantly adjusting the indicator, constantly adjusting the weight. And, like the old joke is in our business, the difference between a great fisherman and an average fisherman is one split shot. It's like, it's just critical, to adjust that weight.
And you want to be, and I know when I've done some of the fishing with the midges under an indicator, I guess I fished them sometimes. Actually, I know there's one technique. One time I was out there fishing, I'm only like 12 inches below the indicator, but I guess that also depends on the depth of your water. How do you determine how far? Because you want to be like a few inches or a foot above those fish, or where are you trying to put that fly if you see the fish?
If I know those fish are fishing, if they're feeding mid column, let's say they're 2 to 3 feet below the surface of the water, then I'll slide my indicator down to where it's about 6 feet, 5 feet above the depth that I'm trying to achieve. So like if the fish aren't actively feeding and they're holding down near the substrate, then you need more weight and a deeper drift. And if they're mid column, obviously you need less weight and shorten your indicator up. And if they're feeding close to the surface, that's a good opportunity to fish with a dry and a dropper. So there's a lot of different techniques that you can use to vary the depth of your flies.
Gotcha. And what's just quickly on a dry dropper, what would be a typical setup you'd use for that?
I kind of, again, base it on what's coming off, but it could be anything from fishing like a high-vis Grifiths Gnat with a little tungsten, dropper, like a midge pupa dropper behind it, to fishing, something big like Amy's ant or a hopper imitation with a beadhead pheasant tail behind it, or a caddis with a beadhead pheasant tail. So, it can vary quite a bit. I typically go anywhere from 12 to 18 inches on my droppers, and typically just fish one dry and one dropper.
Gotcha. Even though you could add another one, but you're kind of using the dry fly, and then 12 inches off that, a little midge pattern just under the surface, or letting that go down on its own weight, or you adding a little bit of maybe a bead head.
Yeah, I usually, I'd use a bead head, and, you can vary your sink rates based on, if you use a glass bead, if you want to keep it, a little closer to the surface, brass bead or a tungsten bead. So you can vary your sink rates just based on the beads that you choose or the flies that you choose to fish as your dropper.
Let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. The Portland Fly Shop, located in the Pearl District in downtown Portland, with over 50 years of combined fly fishing experience in the Pacific Northwest. The Portland Fly Shop has all the gear and knowledge you need to find success, whether on the river or behind the vise. One of Hairline's top 100 dealers in the nation, they have a great fly tying selection and carry all of the top brands, including Sage, Loomis, Hatch, Airflow, and many more. They are your winter steelhead headquarters with over 13 years of guiding experience and 20 years of professional fly tying knowledge. They will get you dialed in on the vise or on the rodder. And I remember actually when I first met Jason, it was a number of years ago in another fly shop, and I knew right away that he totally knew his stuff and he was a super cool guy. So it was pretty cool and surprising when I walked into the Portland shop for the first time and saw the same friendly face there that I remembered from a few years back. So really cool local story here. They offer a wide range of guided trips, adventures up to the Olympic Peninsula and Upper Columbia if you want to kind of get out there without having to go too far. And you can give them a call at 503-265-8060 or visit them online at theportlandflyshop.com. Portland, born and bred, on-site parking just 2 turns off of 405. We are also brought to you by the Gray Drake, who produces high-quality vintage fly wallets and boxes. Their motto, progress through tradition, respect through stewardship. The fly wallets are handmade in the USA with sustainable cork, and these boxes are naturally self-healing, which essentially means that it can hold a little tiny midge or some big daddy stoneflies, and it'll last and hold the flies for years to come. The Hoe River wallet is kind of the Rolls Royce of fly storage. Double lined leather and calf skin protects your flies. High quality wool includes a way to pull out moisture out of the fly. And you'll definitely be proud to pass this one on to the next generation. I personally I've always loved the fly wallets. I remember studying the old wallets that were passed down from my grandfather and my dad, and there's nothing that really comes close to feeling those old those wallets. And Telroy, the wallet the Gray Drake has here is kind of sharing that same tradition. So it's pretty cool, a classic feel, and reminds me of kind of the old days. So right now the Gray Drake is donating a portion of proceeds from all sales through the end of the year to Wild Steelheaders United to help defend remaining runs of wild steelhead in the Pacific Northwest and Idaho. Head over to thegreydrake.com to grab your Flybox wallet today. That's THEGREY Drake.com. Okay, back to the show. Yeah. And have you ever used a hopper with a hopper dropper and a dropper hopper?
I've never done that.
I was just thinking the Drake podcast. I'm not sure if you've heard that one before, but they have Hank Patterson, who's the greatest fly fishing in the world, greatest fly fisherman in the world. He was on in one of the episodes, but he does the intro to the Drake, and that's what his intro is. You have to listen to that episode or listen to him say it. But yeah, I mean, is it typically just a hopper with a dropper?
Yeah, I mean, people do fish, a mini rig, what we call it. So you could have, a hopper and then a bead head like a copper john, and then you could have another dropper off that. So you can, in theory, your big dry fly becomes your strike indicator. And dry and droppers are it's great. You carry 2 rods, and it gives you an opportunity to fish some skinny water that you'll find a lot of feeding fish. And it also is a stealthy way to fish because, a lot of these fish become sensitive to strike indicators. So they can spook from strike indicators. And that's the beautiful thing about a drying dropper.
Yeah, that is cool. Yeah, it is that's your indicator. So same thing, and you can is a dry indicator or that sort of dry dropper more subtle, or do you see better? Can you detect better takes than a normal yarn indicator?
Well, you got a couple things that you look for when you're fishing with drying droppers. A lot of times there'll just be a flash underneath your dry fly that would indicate that you had a take. Again, a large percentage of the strikes go undetected if you're relying strictly on that dry fly to sink. But, sometimes when they grab it, the indicator, the dry fly, will sink and take off or that's obviously an indication that you got to strike. But more times than not, I just see a fish that potentially, the flash of the fish, or you see a mouth. And keep in mind, you're close. You got your dry fly, and then you only have, a foot or 18 inches of tippet there. So you can kind of keep an eye on your dropper pretty easily.
Gotcha. No, this is awesome. I definitely have more, a few more topics I want to dig into, but I had a question I was thinking about from, I guess it was Ray from the Facebook group, and he was talking about more on the casting, and I'm not sure if you go deep into the casting instruction, but he was talking about, one of his questions is fixing, his struggle is the tailing loop. Do you get into the whole steps of, casting instruction, and do you have a tip for somebody that is getting that tailing loop?
I mean, I have a tailing loop myself. I think, casting, if you want to become a proficient caster, you just have to work on it, and spend some time out in the park, but, kind of keep your stroke smooth and try not to overpower it. And, obviously, it's important to be a good caster. You have to be able to get the fly to the fish. For me, we do a fair amount of dry fly fishing, considerably more nymph fishing, but for me, it's more about, getting, the real game begins once the fly's on the water. So if you're a pretty good caster and you can get the fly where you need to be, you're going to be fine. But then, you need to manage your flies, mending and different things like that to get a good drift. So that's, I think, to me, the most important thing is when the flies hit the water, what you do with after that.
Gotcha. And do you have any casting types of casts you use frequently to make sure your fly gets in the right position? And then once it hits the water, what's the process look like?
Well, for a dry fly fisherman, I think, you have to have a good reach mend to be successful, because if you have your fly, if your fly comes in and precedes the tippet, you have a much higher opportunity to catching that fish. I mean, if the fish sees the fly first, you're going to catch more fish. So if you're a good dry fly angler with a good reach mend, you want to have a lot of specialty casts, slack cast and S casts and stuff like that. But I think a reach mend is really, really important. And then for a nymph fisherman, obviously you need to be a good mender as well. But you're doing more of a stack mending approach, where you're just trying to keep some slack into the system. Once it tightens up, then that's when you're dragging. So a little slack is your friend.
Yep.
When you're nymph fishing.
Cool. And what do you think, getting back to the midges, is, for you or most people, is the hardest thing about fishing midges?
I think, most people just have a fear of fishing small flies as a general rule. But, a lot of the flies that I tie, I try to, tie them on a wide gape hook. And I think that's important, like the Tiemco 2488. It's a straight eye scud hook. So, that obviously helps stack the odds in your favor, using, a good hook. And then obviously setting the hook is important too. I mean, a lot of people, they get into a bad habit and they're setting the hook sometimes upstream, which you always want to set downhill. So the hook set should be a firm stroke, but a short range of motion. So, fairly firm, but 12 to 18 inches, good hard set, back into the trout's jaw is what I recommend doing. And you have to be realistic too with when you're fishing, 22s and 24s, that you're not going to land all your fish. You're going to land about 50% of your fish and on a good day. So I think, again, having realistic expectations is important in fishing too.
Gotcha. And what is some of the fish on those small flies? I mean, you guys, I guess, have pretty big fish there. What do you consider a large fish on your system there?
Depends upon the time of year. In Cheeseman, it's we're not dealing with migratory fish like we do when we go out and fish the South Platte, out between Spinney and 11 Mile, where you have lake run fish coming in the shoulder seasons, or you have fish that are approaching 30 inches. But in Cheeseman and Deckers, the areas that I do the majority of my guiding, the fish average in there, the browns are 9 to 15 inches, and the rainbows are 10 to 20. Occasionally we see some fish that exceed the 20-inch mark, but we just catch a lot of nice 14 to 17-inch fish on average.
And are these mostly a mix of browns and rainbows?
It is. The biomass is right around 5,000 fish per mile up in Cheeseman, considerably less than that down at Deckers. But the cool thing about Cheeseman is it's wild trout. It's a self-sustaining population of rainbows and browns, about 60% rainbows, 40% browns. And I think most people know and understand that brown trout are considerably more difficult to fool than rainbows. So the rainbows are typically the bulk of the catch. You catch a lot more rainbows this time of year because the brown trout, they have a tendency to kind of slow their feeding down as the water starts to get cooler. So brown trout, they prefer water temperatures in that 52 to 62 range, and rainbows, their peak temperature preferences are like 42 to 52 degrees. So they each kind of have their season. We catch more brown trout in the summer when the water's warmer, specifically when the lake starts to spill over the spillway. Then the water temperatures get warmer and the brown trout get considerably more active.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was just thinking so the Cheeseman Canyon. Now, do you know the history there? That's kind of a unique name where the Cheeseman came from.
Yeah, it's Walter Scott Cheeseman. He was one of the influential people in the Denver Water Company, back in the day, and so they named the dam after Walter Scott Cheeseman, and he this super influential guy, in water. And then the Gill Trail was named after Carl Gill, who was one of the first settlers in the area. So there's a lot of rich history in the canyon, and all the holes have been named. And so, I think that's part of it, as a fly fisher that frequents Cheeseman Canyon, is to learn some of the history. Dam was built in 1905. So, and, all the holes have been named, and it's just fun to kind of know the holes.
That is cool. The history. That's cool. Do you have like on fishing etiquette, just some general tips? I mean, and what does it look like out there? So you come up and somebody's fishing. I mean, how far down are you going away from these people, or how does that all work?
I think etiquette really depends upon, the number of people on the river. I think, as the crowds increase, then everybody needs to be a little bit more flexible. But I think the thing that's most frustrating, is as an angler, is if there's only a handful of people on the river and somebody starts fishing right next to you. I think that's a poor choice. I mean, if it's not crowded, give guys some room. I mean, give them 3-4 holes. There's nothing worse than somebody short holing you, when it's not necessary. And so, if it's a busy weekend and the holes are limited, then obviously everybody needs to work together. And if you have to pop above a guy, that's part of it, But I think it's just a judgment call. You just gotta try to do as you'd want to be treated out there.
Mm-hmm. Nice. So I wanted to get back to, again, we're thinking fishing the midges, maybe under a strike indicator or a dry dropper. What's the, just typically rod, kind of line, and I guess you talked about the leader, just typical 9-foot 5-weight sort of thing, or any special things to think about there?
Yeah, I mean, a 9-foot 5-weight is pretty ideal for most of the stuff you'll encounter in the Rocky Mountains. It's good for dries, nymphs, and streamers. But if I was gonna try to specialize things a little bit more, a 4-weight's great for dries, and 6-weight is great for streamers. So, you can you can kind of get as specialized as you want with that kind of stuff. But for your traditional nymph fishing, 9 foot, 5 weight, and I like fairly stiff action rod, just so you get nice, quick, crisp hook sets, and I think good for mending and just overall, I think it's the way to go. It's just my preference is a little bit stiffer rod than softer rod.
Gotcha. And you hear a lot, we talked about the Euro nymphing, a lot of the kind of, the real sensitive tip. Is that something else you're all looking for there?
I like just a classic, tip flex rod, it's kind of a stiffer rod. But, I just like quick, hook sets and I don't think you really, need a 10 foot, but some people do use a 10 footer. So, that's another option that you can look into, but just as a general rule, like I said, 9 foot, 5 weight, rather fast action, is what I like to use.
Okay. And I was going to talk a little bit about, so we covered the indicators. Obviously you're going to be fishing those quite a bit unless you're doing, using, dries or whatever, but is there a time when you're going to go away from indicators and dry droppers?
Yeah, there's times when the fish become sensitive to indicators, and there's a few rivers, like the Taylor and the Frying Pan, that you'll see fish that'll actually move out of the way of an indicator. So, that's a good time to just tight line it, and it's an effective strategy as well. And I would have to say that most of the time I do fish with an indicator, but there are times, again, you have to think outside the box and kind of adapt to the conditions.
Okay. And I was thinking about, we might have already kind of covered a little bit of this, but just tips on heavy use waters, how to find those fish. I mean, you talked about sight fishing. Is there anything else, that would help somebody, on those places where things have just been hammered and you're coming in maybe at the end of the day after fish have already been, hammered on it, any way that they can find some fish out there, and maybe some bigger fish as well?
Yeah, I think, just having a good idea on the structure of the river, how to read the river, but, being able to fish, some of the in-between spots, some of the skinny water, some of the pocket water is a great example. I mean, there's so much structure and so much opportunity in pocket water. And I think as a general rule, a lot of people avoid fishing pocket water just because it's difficult to fish and it's difficult to negotiate it. So a lot of times when conditions get crowded, I'll fish, those areas that the average angler is not going to fish. And a lot of the times it's that pocket water. It's that in-between water. It's the water that might not look like it's great water, but there's little buckets and little depressions and little slots in there that oftentimes those are the areas that I target when the fishing, when the pressure gets intense.
Gotcha. So those fish are going to hold, not necessarily, they're going to hold throughout the run. That we've definitely chatted about that, with other guests, that they're not always going to be up in the pools. Are you fishing them? Do you fish all the different water types? Or are there? I do.
Yeah. It really depends upon the time of year too. Obviously you're not going to find as many fish in the pocket water during the winter months when the temperatures drop and they're kind of moving into that slower stuff. But you can still find some areas, some plunge pools, and some soft water margins, even in the winter, that you'll find fish in some of those deeper holes. But I tried to fish it all. I try to teach it all. And again, a lot of times the fish will move into those areas that are less pressured in some of those pockets and riffles that don't look as fishy as others. But oftentimes, if you got a keen eye, you can still find fish in those areas, and that's kind of where I have to go sometimes when it gets busy.
Gotcha. And is a good technique for somebody new coming out to a new tailwater to, just cover as much water as you can? If you had a half a day to fish, would you say just start at the top and work your way down, or start at the bottom and work your way up, or how do you recommend somebody new to it?
Yeah, I would find the area that you want to fish, and I usually start at the bottom, and then I'm methodical. You don't want to you don't want to leave any money on the table, but at the same time, you know, you don't want to wear out your welcome. So, you know, I try to get into a particular run, and I like to be systematic, you know, and cover the water well and then move on. I think, you know, the first few drifts through any hole or run or riffle is going to be your best chance of catching a fish. So, you know, work the run thoroughly, methodically, and then move on to the next hole. And if you're fishing pocket water, then, you know, you really do have to have more of a dissecting approach where you're just, you know, fishing the seams, fishing the pockets, the pools, and again, just being thorough and methodical and just moving your way through it.
Gotcha. So you're not necessarily getting into one section and hitting it with a certain pattern and then switching up and going back through with another one and then maybe multiple patterns. You're more moving, covering water.
I cover a lot of water. There are times, though, that, you know, you might, you know, nymph a hole, and then if you haven't, you know, got the results that you were looking for, you might run a streamer through it. You know, I tend to carry multiple rods in the shoulder seasons when streamers can be effective in fooling some of the larger fish. So, you know, I mean, you can certainly, you know, do multiple tactics in one area. You know, you might start throwing a dry fly and then nymph it, and you can even run a streamer through it. But most of the time, I mean, the majority I'm carrying just my nymph rod, and that's what I'm using. You know, just being real methodical and, again, trying to sight fish and keep my flies in front of feeding fish and just moving and covering a lot of water. I think that's a huge tip. I think you just got to keep finding fresh fish.
Gotcha. Yeah, the streamers, I definitely, maybe we'll save it for next time to talk about streamers. I actually had Kelly Gallup. Well, he's coming up here in a little while to talk about streamers, and we go deep into some of the history there. And it was kind of funny because we got into a whole conversation about some stuff that I wasn't expecting on kind of his background and stuff, and it was pretty funny. But it kind of got me thinking, you know, for you, is there anything that you know, something that, you know, people know? You've got books, you got a lot of resources out there. Anything you want to share that people don't know about you?
Gosh, I don't know. I just consider myself to be one of the guys, and I consider myself to be extremely fortunate to have made a living in this industry, and I do. I like sharing. I like learning. I like everything about this. Supportive wife and family, and gosh, I'm just.
So you don't have any kind of create. I'll just give you the example with Kelly. People could look forward to this coming up here, but you've probably heard some of his flies. He's got these crazy flies, like I think one of them's like the tits up. He's got the dungeon, the sex dungeon, I think. I don't know. He's got all these like kind of porn names, right? And I said, Kelly, so what's up with all the porn names, you know? And were you like a porn star back in the 70s or something? And and he didn't deny it, which you know, it was kind of funny, that conversation. But so you don't have any baggage that you know, if you're running for political office, you'd be kicked out?
I don't think so. Not that I'm aware of.
All right, good. Yeah, that's always funny. There's you know, the conversations that we've had here has been part of the fun. You know, Gearrock, we talked about the 60s, so I get a little hit from some of the listeners too, because sometimes they come back and say, hey, keep on the fly fishing, we want to learn about fly fishing. So this is good. I think we've covered it pretty well. Is there anything we haven't covered here when you think of tailwaters and fishing tiny flies so far?
I think we've touched on a lot of important things. You know, it's just important to just keep wanting to learn. You know, just always remain open-minded to getting better every time you get out. And I think that if you do that, I think you're going to go a long ways and be a very successful tailwater angler.
Okay, and I actually have a few. Do you want to do a little rapid-fire round here?
Sure.
I've got just a few questions I always like to ask, and we can probably bust through these pretty quick. You know, starting this off, I like to ask the kind of the 2, and 2, which is, you know, your favorite 2 flies, your 2 tips, and maybe 2 resources when it comes to tailwaters, and you know, and I guess we could talk about midges or tiny flies. But do you have first start off? You mentioned a couple. Do you have your 2 if you just had to go for your 2 midge patterns?
I think, you know, my 2 favorite midge patterns are no doubt a black beauty of some sort. You know, there's a lot of variations of that. You got the got a tungsten bead on, and I got a mercury bead on, and I got a flashback variation and the standard one, and so a black beauty of some sort, and then the top secret midge. And those are my two go-to midge patterns, 365 days a year.
Gotcha. Okay, and I'm trying to figure out. I'll put a link to those. There's probably some videos out there and some photos of those flies, so I'll get those covered. And so, yeah, and you've mentioned a bunch of tips so far. Do you have any, maybe a couple of your main go-to tips? Maybe we've talked about already, but just your top two for fishing tailwaters and midges?
I think, probably one of the most important things, or two things, presentation. That it's everything. I mean, it's if you have a good presentation, you're going to catch fish, and it's critical. I mean, good technique equals fish. And a friend of mine and a colleague of mine a long time ago, Dan Wright, said that, and I still believe it today, and I did then. And so there's really no substitution for solid technique out there. And then I think sight fishing, that's key. Just being able to read the water and have your flies in front of fish, and not, randomly fishing water that may not have fish in it. I mean, obviously you're going to do so much better if you're keeping your flies in front of fish. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool tip because, probably a lot of people don't realize the sight fishing piece. They go in just kind of looking like, there's obstructions, some different water, but that's cool to know that you can go in there and actually target those fish and see them. And I guess for streamers, if you're using streamers, it's going to be the same thing. You're going to be sight fishing as well.
Yeah, you can, streamers, you can sight fish, and you can also just blind fish. And, typically when I'm fishing with streamers, I'll fish two streamers. I'll have one dark streamer and one light streamer, and I usually run like a white streamer up front, and then I trail something, gray, brown, or black behind it. And it's a tandem rig, and it's an attractor. The white's an attractor, but I can see the streamer coming, and I can see the fish chasing it. So I can kind of more of a locator fly, and that's what I do with my streamers.
Gotcha. I was just looking at the show. The show notes for this will be at wetflyswing.com/56. So I'll have all the links here to the things we talked about. And we talked about the rods. Is there a rod type or company that you recommend, you like that would be good for this type of fishing?
Yeah, I mean, I fish with Sage rods, and I mean, I like the X, and I like the 1 and the VXP. Those are the rods that I fish with most of the time.
Okay. And we don't talk a lot about reels, but is there a reel company, and then also what line would you recommend?
I fish a lot of Ross reels and a lot of Sage reels.
Yep.
And I use Scientific Anglers fly lines and tippet. I like that the new Amplitude Infinity Smooth. I mean, that's a great line. New line, floats great, and it's a fantastic option.
Perfect. And do you, on the lines, is it important to you clean your lines a lot?
I try to, I mean, I usually will just get a pad and clean them. And, I mean, a fly line, unfortunately, they cost a lot of money, but you want to take care of them. So I think if you maintain them and keep them clean, then they're going to float better for you, and they just respond better for you. You can mend better, you can cast better, and that's an important thing.
Yep, and cast better, yeah, and everything else. That's cool. And then your two resources. I know you have some books we'll talk about here in a sec, but maybe a couple of resources that aren't necessarily your own stuff that you would recommend for somebody.
Well, I think one thing you have to keep an eye on the flows. For us, it's important to get that information on the flows before you go fishing. So the Division of Natural Resources has a gauging system that you can get the flows. I think that's important. And then I don't know, just the network of guides and colleagues that I work with is critical. And I try to share that information on my fishing report. So just having people in the know, guides on the Colorado River, guides over on the Blue River, guides on the South Platte. So that kind of information, you get good information from your colleagues, and then you can share it with the angling community.
Gotcha. So if somebody wanted some information on that area, they could just call up the call up your shop and get some information on what's going on and head on out.
Exactly. And I have a fishing report on my website that updates the flows and then the current conditions, what's going on, flies, and so on and so forth.
Okay. And one thing, just going back to it's the Blue Angler fly shop?
Yeah, it's our fly shop's the Blue Quill Angler.
Oh, the Blue Quill, yeah.
Yeah, the Blue Quill Angler, and then we have a website there as well, and then I have my personal website, which is the one that we discussed earlier in the show.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, and what? Just briefly, could you take us back to that moment when you became a co-owner of the fly shop? What that, take us back to when that happened, what that felt like?
I started guiding at the Blue Quill back in 1992, and I was working behind 4 other very seasoned guides at the time. So I was at the bottom of the food chain, but I was able to work my way up. And then in 2002, then I became partners with Jim Cannon, who has since retired and moved to Florida and just enjoying life. And then now I have 2 other partners, Steve Parrott and Dennis Steinbeck. So yeah, it's been a great ride, and shop's been in business for 30 years, and it's been great. We've been able to supply knowledge and materials and stuff to people that have the same passion that we do.
Yeah, and are you going to be guiding? Do you think is this like until your old age, or do you have other plans with the guiding? Is it something you're going to stick with?
I want to keep guiding for a while. I'm 55 now, so been doing it for 25 years, and I used to do more guiding now, but I'm down. I've backed off to about 100 to 175 days a year. So I hope that I can do this for another 10 years, and then I'll probably slide back into more of the fly shop role. But right now I'm not in the shop that often, and the good news is we've got very talented people that run the day-to-day operations of the shop, and it gives me the opportunity to stay out in the field where I really like to be.
Gotcha. Sounds awesome. And then on your books, do you have one book you want to mention that you're kind of most proud of, or something you want to note there?
Well, my fly fishing guide to the South Platte River is going to be out in about 2 weeks. It's a revision of my original project that I did back in 2005, but that's a completely revised edition. So I'm excited to get that back out. It's gonna be a whole new look, a whole new feel, and it's been updated, and several sections have been added. For instance, the South Platte, Denver, and the good conversation on the still waters out in South Park. So that's always a special project. It was my first one, but it's completely updated. And then Colorado Guide Flies, I think that was one of the most rewarding books that I've written. So it's been fun. I've enjoyed them all. They've all been a little bit different, but those are probably the 2 most important to me.
Okay. And do you have a piece of gear that's kind of your go-to piece of gear? It doesn't necessarily have to be fly fishing or fly gear, anything when you're out fishing or traveling that you kind of can't leave home without?
Yeah, I think probably the most important piece of gear for me is my my waist pack, because it's got everything I need to work.
Yeah, and that's actually your vest? You go with like the waist pack?
Yeah, I've got a fish pond. I've got the guide pack, and it's a great piece of gear. I can keep numerous fly boxes and all the tools of the trade in there, and that's what I work out of every day. So probably that's the single most important piece of gear I carry.
Cool. Yeah, fish pond I haven't. I guess I've had some fish pond gear. They have some good stuff, and I chatted with Russell Miller. Haven't had him on yet, but I know he works for Fish Pond and also does some competitive angling. So that's cool. Well, I'm just about there. Just wanted to check in. One thing, I just had a note on the irrigation. I didn't want to go deep into this, but I thought it was interesting when you talked about the Cheeseman Canyon. The guy, a pretty prominent person, part of the water department. I know that some of the rivers I fished, there's been issues with water in the past where to the extreme where some of these the irrigation has blown out some of these tailwater fisheries that maybe used to be good. It sounds like in your area there is some fluctuation, but it sounds like the river is the number one priority there, and the fishery. Is that kind of how you see it?
Well, the main goal of Cheeseman Reservoir is to supply downstream irrigation demand and water for the city of Denver. And I mean, that takes precedence over anything. But the good news is that the Denver Water Board works closely with the anglers. They monitor flows, they monitor temperatures, and they really do try to, in addition to providing water for the city and the outlying areas, they really do try to take care of the fishery. And I think that's really important. For instance, this past year we had a flash flood that dumped a lot of sediment and debris in the river, and they did flushes for us. I mean, so they're really concerned not only about delivering water, but they're also concerned about the resource. And so I think that's part of the reason why this fishery is so successful, is because of the management of it. It's taken good care of.
That's cool. All right, Pat. Well, maybe you can just let us know in the next 6 to 12 months if you have anything else you want to note here coming out, or anything you have any big things going on.
Not really. That's right now the biggest thing is going to be the South Platte book coming out, and then it's that time of year where I'm doing quite a bit of traveling and speaking to fly fishing clubs and doing shows and that kind of stuff. Yeah. So it's I'll be out and about, and look forward to visiting with people and
that's great.
The different areas that we go to.
Are you going to get around? Do you get around just mostly your area, or do you get around the country, or what areas do you cover when you do on the tour or the circuit?
Yeah, I go everywhere. I go wherever the demand is. I mean, we go fly fishing show out in Edison to Trout Fest down in Texas, and a lot of the local stuff around here. I'm going to be in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. I'm getting around quite a bit these days, so I feel very blessed for that opportunity.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll keep up with you, and I guess the best place is Pat Dorsey, flyfishing.com if people want to find you.
Yep, and then Instagram. I do a lot of stuff on Instagram.
Oh,
Pat Dorsey Fly Fishing on Instagram. You can see the day-to-day action and the photographs. That's probably something too that I'm very passionate about. Photography. I mean, that's one thing that I enjoy a whole lot is just outdoor photography.
Yeah, I've noticed that on your Instagram. I'm glad you brought that up, because I've seen you got some beautiful pictures there. It's obvious the difference when you see an Instagram from somebody who's kind of working, kind of a pro or really working on it versus the others. And do you have maybe one photo tip you might leave us with for maybe fishing or just outdoor?
It's photography it's like anything else. It just takes time to master it, and I don't know, a good friend of mine, he just said, just produce good images. Don't ever post anything that's crummy. And so, just learn how to read the light and take good images, and that's what it's all about. It helps tell the story, and you can share the day with your customers and let your followers know what you're up to, and I think people really enjoy that.
Nice. All right, well, that's perfect, Pat. I'll let you get out here, but just wanted to thank you for coming on and sharing all your knowledge and wisdom here. I think there's probably a few questions that are going to come up from this because we couldn't get to everything, but I think we covered tailwaters and what you do out there. So I'll keep in touch, and if anything comes up, I'll drop you a line.
Sounds great.
All right, we'll see you later.
Thanks for having me on. All right, bye now.
So there you go. If you want to find all the show notes with all the links we covered, just go to wetflyswing.com/56. And I want to give a shout out really quickly to some of our new Patreons this week over at Patreon. You can go to wetflyswing.com/Patreon, Patreon. But I want to give a quick shout out to Hunter and Greg, and another shout out to Jimmy, my man Jimmy. Just wanted to thank you guys for supporting the show, and you can head over to if you want to join the journey and go a little deeper with the show, get bonus content. You can head over to Patreon, check us out, and there's a bunch of cool information there, some bonus stuff. So, and one other thing before I let you go, you can text WFS to 31996. That's an easy way to subscribe so you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes. Thanks again for stopping by to check out the show today. I'm looking forward to catching up with you soon and hope to connect with you online or on the river. Later.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com. And if you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes.